Right. I believe before we start to analyze the history, it's very important to premise our conversation around global transformation to what?
Absolutely.
Whose order will we be thinking about when we are thinking about the future? Because history is not just about what happened in the past. History is about what's happening now, and history is also about what will or could happen in the future. But having said that, we have to very much consider the context in which we understand global transformation historically, the histories of state formation for the different regions in the world, for the different countries. We need to understand historical legacies, how we choose to um, how we choose to remember. Uh, and you mentioned an interesting context there where we addressed global transformation in a post World War II era, getting into the Cold War, right? This whole the Bretton Woods establishment and the reinforcement of American hegemony. Before that, we had a global transformation, a global order established under Pax Britannia, under the dominance of the British. And before that, you could think about possibly the French and the Spanish and Portuguese. But going forward, we had the Cold War, we had the competition and transformation or lack of transformation, this balance of competition of power between the East and the West. That framework collapsed with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and the world transformed itself into a new order or disorder. There was no longer the two polar areas around the East and the West. And there was this sense of the global triumphalism of the liberal democratic order. And somehow, those in the West felt that post Cold War, we could transform the globe to a neoliberal democratic order with global institutions premised on globalist and neoliberal ideals. We had a massive transformation in the post 1990s of hyper-globalization. And this particularly disenfranchised countries in the global south. We're thinking India, we're thinking, many countries in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. But we then find ourselves, in conclusion, in a current multipolar order where the global there's really no global hegemon, and this new global transformation has created an order, but it's also created a disorder at the same time. So by that I mean, as much as the US is a global hegemon, as we know with Trump, he's really moved into an American first position, meaning this is also very undefined and very contradictory in many instances. Is America first, does that mean non-interventionism? Is that neo-isolationism? Is that neoconservatism? Or a new, transformation of neo-conservatism? So that is yet to be defined. But even as Trump, pulls America back from its interactions with global institutions and the global order, we also find a re-emergence and a re-appreciation of the global south within this context of global transformation. And here we see new centers of power around the global south, around BRICS, around developing countries, and a lot of countries that came into the fore in the post-World War II era. This being, major players like India, for example, South Africa, countries like Egypt, many of the players within BRICS, and of course, former powers like Russia, which are also very instrumental. So I guess in conclusion, I'm saying going forward, this global transformation really hasn't defined itself, but it definitely cannot be the old order of the Cold War of bipolarity. It seems to have morphed into a central element of multipolarity. But how do we then redefine this multipolarity? So this is a very good question. What is Africa's position? How does Africa position itself between, two major competing or, what has been a dominant, historical dominant hegemon, the US, right? And a rising competing power, which would be China, which the US would perceive to be Russia, broadly understood, as we think about NATO and European security, which would be India. What are the new emerging dynamics when we think global transformation around, for example, multilateral security framework, say around NATO, where, for instance, Trump has tended to downplay the role of NATO, the importance of Europe, and has actually taken a very much America first policy. But going on to the premise of your question around the global south, how do you navigate this new global transformation? It's going to be very difficult and very challenging. And it's going to really depend on the individual context of the global south country that we're talking about. Because we have to remember, when we talk about the global south, we're talking a whole basket full of very different countries. So, for example, is China still in the global south? Or is China now a first world country? China likes to see itself as part of the global south, as championing the cause of the global south. But a lot of analysts would argue economically China is no longer within the global south. India is a nuclear power, has some of the most advanced systems of education and science, and is considered a global south country. And so is Somalia and Afghanistan, which are global south countries, that are failing states. And we have everything else in between. So I say that to say this. If we're going to talk about global south and what should be the global south position, it becomes very complicated because a lot of these national interests do not travel well geographically. What Somalia needs as a national security interest would be very different than what India, which is a major power, surrounded by very dominant players in China and Russia, these are very different spaces. We must also add that when we think about the global south, we have this new dynamic of multilateralism. Now, if we're going to talk about what is the stake of the global south in this new order, again, it gets very complicated and very difficult to define. So, for example, within BRICS, we have South Africa, which is a major power on the continent, but is not a major power on the global stage, at least compared to China and India or Brazil or Russia, which are also members of that very same global south organization. So I say that to say this, that even within the global south dichotomy, we tend to start to see the development of hierarchies, whereby powers like China, which cannot dominate on a global stage, want to retransform and rebrand themselves to dominate within a global south space. And in other words, eat their cake and have it. Be a major world powers outside, BRICS, but also when they come to the developing country scenario, also frame themselves as, developing countries like everybody else. But I think lastly, we then come to this broader question of what exactly is this new global transformation and how do we understand it in a global south context? Will it be multilateralism, which seems to be the emerging order, or unilateralism, which we see in terms of how major powers disregard international law and assert their interests. We've seen this with the US in Iraq, we've seen this with Russia in Ukraine, and we've seen this even with China in Tibet. And some might argue with India, and say separatist regions in Kashmir, or India's relationship with Pakistan. Second element of this is, where do we draw the line in terms of multilateralism and unilateralism? Mm-hmm. How do we understand global ideologies as it perceives itself around democracy and autocracy? That really seems to be a very shifting ball. I think, and then lastly, how are we then going to redefine hegemony versus this broader aspect of multipolarity? Do we really have hegemons? Do we have regional hegemons? How is Russia, for example, reasserting its space within Europe? How is China reasserting its space, not only within the global south, but even within its own neighborhood, in terms of how China threatens India, how China threatens Russia, even though all those countries consider themselves to be part of the global south? I think it's a very interesting and enduring conversation. Right. Alliances of interest against alliances of ideologies. And here then we are thinking about neorealism, right? The primacy of material and strategic interests above ideological, normative, and constructed, interests. And in the case of Africa, I think in many instances we do start to see how cunning and how clever a lot of global south countries have been, particularly in the African continent, to play East against West, to play major hegemons against each other, while hedging their interests around major global powers, but also playing off one global power against another. For example, the US against China and China against the US. And we see this very, very much, for example, in the case of Rwanda, right? Where Rwanda has been very strategic about using its position to shoot above its weight, to extend its interests into the Eastern DRC, to extract minerals from the Eastern DRC and secure those minerals, at the behest of major global powers, in this case, the US and China. But at the same time, keeping close to China so that when the US accuses Rwanda of human rights abuses or abuses in the DRC, Rwanda can remind the Western countries and Western powers about the Rwandese genocide and about how Rwanda is also securing their scramble for these rare minerals within the DRC. So the African countries and many global south countries have become very skilled at playing off these major powers. But I must add that there is a danger for African countries in engaging in that game. And we see this within the Sahelian region, where moves of countries in the Sahel, where we're thinking, for example, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger, right? Moves to democracy have been trampled over with the return of military strongmen, right? A return to autocracy. Rebranding and a move away and an abandonment of la francophonie, right? This idea of closeness to France and, this very paternalistic relationship between France and its former colonies in West Africa, and how a lot of those Sahelian countries are moving not only from democracy towards autocracy, they're embracing autocracy and military government, but they're also embracing new and emerging powers, like Russia. But I say the danger in that is sometimes African countries can overplay their hand, because African countries and global south countries are still relatively weak. In many cases, they cannot regulate their borders. And yes, they have agency, but they cannot overextend their reach. And we see some of these contradictions in the Sahel, for example, in countries like Mali and Niger, whereby even though those countries have abandoned France as a provider of security and embraced the Wagner Group and the Russians and Chinese, we still see the expansion of terrorist groups within those countries and a threat to the national security of those countries, even as we speak. So the status quo has not changed. They're still broadly insecure, speaking to these specific countries, even though they've tried to play global players and global alliances against themselves. So even as much as we think about this new order, we think about global South countries playing strategic ambiguity, there is an extent to which they can play that game, because it can come back to bite them, as we see in the case of many Sahelian countries, and also as we see in the case of the DRC, where countries are now interested in the DRC, not because 6 million people have been massacred there over the last 30 years, but essentially because of these economies of violence, of extraction of those rare minerals within the Democratic Republic of Congo.